Hey, welcome back to my channel. Another edition of reading time. I will do some rap soon, I promise. It's just been a really busy week. Anyway, I thought I would just jump on and read something real quick. Karl Popper. So he wrote this, The Open Society and Its Enemies. Now, I can't claim to have read the whole thing. It's kind of a lengthy critique on philosophy, and this volume in particular is kind of based on Plato, I believe, because I haven't read the whole thing. But it contains one of the most quoted passages of modern philosophy, of philosophy of the 20th century, that's having a rise on the internet now. That is the paradox of tolerance. So fundamentally, this book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, talking about our civilization, the threats to it, its foundational principles, and sort of later on in the piece, and a lot after the original writing, I believe, Karl Popper added a bunch of notes, addendums basically, and one of them is this paradox of tolerance. So I think what I'll do is, okay, so the reason why this is being referenced so often is that basically people want to say that there are certain ideologies which you should be justified in responding to in a violent way. If somebody is preaching some intolerant ideology, then a violent response to that ideology is justified. And in general, the intolerant ideology that people use this to attack is sort of your classic first half of the century or 1930s to early 1940s Germans and Austrians. I'm not going to say the name because this channel is very, very, very popular, and I don't want to get shadow banned. So it's used to target those guys, and F those guys, of course, F those guys hard. But when you actually read the paradox of tolerance, those might not be the only, or even the most apt, or even the group that Karl Popper originally intended to be talking about when he wrote these notes. Let's read it and then discuss. It's short, so this is going to be a short reading time. Less well known is the paradox of tolerance. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed, and tolerance with them. In this formulation, I do not imply, for instance, that we should always suppress the utterance of intolerant philosophies. As long as we can counter them by rational argument and keep them in check by public opinion, suppression would certainly be most unwise. But we should claim the right to suppress them, if necessary, even by force. For it may easily turn out that they are not prepared to meet us on the level of rational argument, but begin by denouncing all argument. They may forbid their followers to listen to rational argument, because it is deceptive, and teach them to answer arguments by the use of their fists or pistols. We should therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right not to tolerate the... Sorry, I'm going to read that again. We should claim, therefore, in the name of tolerance, the right not to tolerate the intolerant. We should claim that any movement preaching intolerance places itself outside the law, and we should consider incitement to intolerance and persecution as criminal, in the same way as we should consider incitement to murder or to kidnapping or to the revival of the slave trade as criminal. Okay, so it's just one paragraph, and it's a note. So I think he wrote. I think the original book. I'm going to fudge this, but I think he wrote it in the early 40s, 1943 maybe. These notes came a long time afterwards, and so I think in the 60s basically. So so the way this is presented at the moment is basically, you've got these kind of neo nasties. If they pop up at any moment, you should have the right to respond to them violently. So that's the way it's framed at the moment. That's the way Popper becomes referenced. Now, that's kind of one possible reading of it. And yeah, sure, that group, if they acted in the way he described, he would be encouraging that a violent response is not kept off the table. But there's a couple of crucial sentences in there that he said that are often ignored in the current discourse. And one is, he said that the suppression of speech is not to be encouraged. It's not, he's not trying to give an admonition of freedom of speech. He's basically saying that the suppression of speech is undesirable. So it's not an argument that if somebody simply comes with an ideology, they should be suppressed. That isn't the argument. What he says is that the right to respond with violence to an ideology shouldn't be off the table in the case that someone is practicing an ideology in a violent way. Because he said that the first step of somebody preaching an intolerant doctrine is to tell their followers to not use verbal argument or discourse, to distrust discourse because it's deceptive, and instead use fists and guns. Okay, so use violence. So the minute somebody preaches intolerance, as in tells their followers to take to the streets with fists and guns and not take any discussion and just be violent basically, that's the moment when society is justified in responding violently or should consider the possibility that it might be necessary to respond violently to those practitioners of that ideology. Okay, so he's writing in 1943 originally, and I think he's writing these notes around the 60s. Now let's take the brown shirts and the black shirts, especially, well, they're both great examples of it, but taking the brown shirts, am I getting that right? No, the black shirts, the Italians, they kind of coined the method of street violence, and I think they were doing stuff like force-feeding castor oil to people and make them shit themselves in the street, and that would have been one of the most benign things that they did. But basically they were out in the street being thugs. They were being violent. It would have been justified in Popper's estimation to respond violently to them. It would have saved, an awful lot of an awful lot of events of the 20th century if maybe a more robust response could have been mustered to those guys, black shirts and brown shirts. But in the latter half of the 20th century, post-World War II, and now, who is behaving in the way that he described? Who is behaving in the way that they're telling their followers not to engage in discourse because it's deceptive, and not to practice freedom of speech, and to use fists? Okay, guns, a little over the top, but let's say fists and bars and you know, encouraging people to punch people. Who's doing that? You know, yeah, sure, it's likely some of these neo-nasties groups are doing that. Yeah, a violent response would be justified. But there are other groups, aren't there? So I'm not going to share any of my ideas. I think I've made it clear. But you know, who, if you want to leave a comment down below, who have you noticed in the world, on the world stage, preaching an ideology that tells people to not engage in rational verbal discourse, and instead just use violence as a means to attain their ends? Because our boy Karl would like to know about them, and he'd like you to pay close attention to them. Before I sign off on this one, I just wanted to note the name of this book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. Because for sure, you know, I just find it incredibly ironic. You've got that fella, I'm going to call him Sorge Joros, and he calls his foundation the Open Society Foundation. I haven't looked into it. It's just a pet theory, but I think, you know, there's a parallel, there's an irony at least, or maybe he did get the name from this, but calling his society the Open Society, and practicing what he does, which is to try to just vanquish nation states and make them open up for the free flow of any and all between states, and just, you know, with predictable effects. That to me is an example of something that guarantees a threat to the open society that I think our friend Karl would recognize. That's a threat to an open society for sure, because if you import a bunch of people who don't share your ideas of tolerance, that's it. Tolerance is gone. It just disappears like that. It's happened predictably and trackably throughout history. So our friend Sorge Joros and the Open Society Foundation, definitely a threat to the open society. Well, anyway, there's a bit of reading time, a little bit of reading time, a bit of ranting time. Hope you liked that one. And again, it's been a busy week. I will be attempting to produce something more musical this week, but no promises because it's crazy times. So take care out there, in the remnants of the open society, and yeah, peace.